Big news from the Supreme Court this week. First, the Supreme Court is poised to consider President Trump's argument that his prosecution should be barred by the doctrine of presidential immunity. Plus, the Supreme Court has announced that it will decide a tremendously important case with huge implications for special counsel Jack Smith's prosecution of President Trump on the bogus charges related to January 6th and so-called election interference. It looks to me like there is a very good chance that the court will rule that one of the statutes at the heart of the prosecution of President Trump can't be used to criminalize conduct related to the events on January 6th at the Capitol. Then, in our deep dive segment, Israel's war to destroy Hamas and save Western civilization continues. But is the United States doing enough to support Israel and counter the threat posed by Hamas and its Iranian overlords? The answer is no. It is time for the United States to step up and take real, meaningful action to support Israel and oppose Hamas and Iran. All that, plus behind the headlines on this week's episode of Founding Principles with Doug Wardlow. As always, I'm your host, Doug Wardlow.
A battle for the fate of America rages. The radical left seeks to destroy the very foundations of our republic. God, the family, and the Constitution are under attack. Amidst the chaos, Doug Wardlow speaks truth and points the way back to freedom. It is time to go on offense. This is Founding Principles with Doug Wardlow.
There has been a lot of action at the U.S. Supreme Court this week with implications for the bogus criminal prosecution of President Trump brought by special counsel Jack Smith in the Federal District Court for the District of Columbia. Jack Smith filed a petition for certiorari before judgment with respect to President Trump's argument that presidential immunity bars the court from proceeding with its prosecution. And he also filed a motion to expedite consideration of the petition for certiorari. That petition was granted. But what exactly does all of that mean? Well, let me break it down for you. A petition for certiorari is basically a request to have the Supreme Court review a decision by a lower court. Usually, this happens after a judgment has been reached in a case and after an appeal. But here, Jack Smith is seeking to have the court review a decision of a lower court before judgment has been reached in the case at issue. In addition, Smith asked the court to expedite its consideration of the petition for certiorari, and the Supreme Court said that it would go ahead and do that. Well, that means that the petition for certiorari will likely be decided within weeks. If the petition for certiorari before judgment is granted, then the Supreme Court will move forward and consider the merits of the decision before it. That is, the Supreme Court would, if the petition for certiorari is granted, consider and decide the question of whether presidential immunity bars the prosecution of President Trump. So why is Jack Smith seeking expedited review of the question of presidential immunity at the Supreme Court? Well, the district court, that is the trial court, has set President Trump's trial for March 4th. President Trump moved to dismiss the case against him on the grounds of presidential immunity, but the trial court judge denied President Trump's motion, rejecting Trump's presidential immunity argument. President Trump appealed that ruling to the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals. When President Trump noticed his appeal to the D.C. Circuit, that automatically suspended the trial proceedings, and President Trump then moved for a stay of all trial court proceedings pending the outcome of his appeal, and that was granted. So as things stand, it was almost impossible to have the trial on March 4th. So Jack Smith decided to try and skip over the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals by seeking expedited review at the U.S. Supreme Court. Jack Smith is no doubt hoping that he can get the Supreme Court to affirm the trial judge's denial of President Trump's motion to dismiss and get that denial quickly, and thus keep his plan to put Trump on trial in March on track. So this is all just more evidence, as if we needed any more evidence, that the entire prosecution is 100% political. Smith wants the trial to take place before the election, and he wants to put Trump in prison before the election. If the election were held today, it's quite clear from all the polling that Trump would win in an electoral landslide. So Smith wants to do everything he can to speed up proceedings and make sure he can have his politically motivated show trial as soon as possible. It's a gross abuse of the legal system. But I think Smith may have miscalculated because President Trump's immunity argument is a pretty solid one. Plus, another piece of very important news broke this week concerning the Supreme Court that spells additional trouble for Jack Smith's nefarious plans, and I'll talk about that shortly. But first, let's consider for a moment President Trump's presidential immunity argument for dismissal of the criminal charges against him related to so-called election interference and the incident at the Capitol on January 6th. Well, the trial court rejected President Trump's argument, but the Supreme Court will likely soon have its say, and it's quite possible that they will side with President Trump. That's because the basis for President Trump's argument is a good one, rooted in the text and Constitution and the separation of powers. Now, as an initial matter, it's important to remember that all of the conduct alleged in Jack Smith's indictment is conduct that occurred when Trump was president, and all of it is connected to the president's official duties as president. It is the president's job to ensure that federal election laws are followed, after all. Because the indictment concerns conduct at the heart of the president's official responsibilities as president, Presidential immunity applies and should be an absolute bar to the prosecution of the former president for his alleged conduct in office that forms the basis for the federal prosecution in D.C. President Trump's argument is based largely on the Supreme Court's ruling in Nixon versus Fitzgerald. In that case, the Supreme Court ruled that a president has absolute immunity from any civil liability for any and all acts that fall within what the court described as the outer perimeter of the president's official responsibilities. The ruling is based on the separation of powers. If a president could be hauled into court after the expiration of their term and held civilly liable for his official conduct as president, well, the knowledge of that possibility would cloud the president's judgment. It would make it difficult for the president to act and to execute the duties of his office. It would make the judiciary the judge of the president's official actions as president, and give the judiciary the power to question, impose penalties on, and thus interfere with the actions of the president. The separation of powers is vitally important because, as the Constitution's framers correctly judged, the best defense of liberty and the best way to prevent the rise of tyranny is to divide the three types of government power and vest those powers in separate and independent authorities that act as checks on one another. But when one branch of the government usurps or interferes with the powers of another branch, or takes those powers onto itself, well, that upsets the balance and opens the door for abuses of power and the growth of government in general at the expense of individual liberty. Now, the Nixon versus Fitzgerald presidential immunity doctrine dealt only with civil liability, not criminal liability. The immunity doctrine hasn't been tested in the criminal context. Well, that's because no president before President Trump had ever been subjected to lawless, baseless criminal prosecutions for their official conduct in the manner that Trump has. But the reasoning of the Fitzgerald case applies to the criminal context just as well as it applies to the civil context. And President Trump's motion to dismiss, it did a very good job of presenting that argument. President Trump also bases his immunity argument in the text of the Constitution itself, specifically the impeachment clause. The impeachment clause of Article 1 provides that although impeachment proceedings do not themselves carry a punishment beyond removal from office, when an impeached official is convicted by the Senate following impeachment by the House, then the impeached and convicted official, quote, shall nevertheless be liable and subject to indictment, trial, and punishment according to the law, close quote. So the text of the Constitution plainly implies that absent impeachment and conviction, a president cannot be subsequently criminally prosecuted for acts that fall within the president's official duties. Recall that the Democrats impeached President Trump twice, but on both occasions, President Trump was acquitted by the Senate. Because President Trump was never convicted by the Senate following impeachment, he can't be prosecuted for his official conduct, that is, all of his acts that fall within at least the outer perimeter of his official duties. And all of the acts alleged in the indictment fall within that outer perimeter. So President Trump's presidential immunity argument has a decent chance of success at the Supreme Court. And if the court rules in Trump's favor, that will spell the end of Jack Smith's criminal prosecution in federal district court in D.C. But there's another reason for hope that Jack Smith's D.C. criminal case against Trump may not be on very solid footing. That's because earlier this week, the Supreme Court announced that it would hear a case wherein it will decide whether one of the defendants involved in the events at the Capitol on January 6, 2021, can be charged for obstructing an official proceeding. So according to Breitbart News, Joseph Fisher was indicted on 7 charges after January 6, but the charge in question is a count under provision enacted after the Enron scandal for anyone who, quote, corruptly obstructs, influences, or impedes an official proceeding. And this section is 18 U.S.C. 1512. That particular criminal statute is at the heart of Jack Smith's indictment against President Trump. If the Supreme Court decides that criminal statute, section 1512, cannot be applied to the facts in the case involving the January 6th defendant, then Jack Smith won't be able to use it against President Trump either. And that would gut a significant portion of Jack Smith's indictment against President Trump. You see, the argument over this particular statute and its applicability to persons involved in the events on January 6th went before the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals about a year ago. And that court decided Joseph Fisher's case. And when it did so, a 3-judge panel of the D.C. Circuit ruled where the defendants were arguing that the statute didn't apply to their behavior and that it is unconstitutionally vague. Those were the arguments of the defendants. Each judge on that 3-judge panel issued a separate opinion. So it's kind of difficult to tell which is the controlling opinion of the court. Well, one of the judges, Judge Greg Kaxis, pointed out in his opinion that the way that the statute is written is unusually vague and thus constitutionally problematic. Specifically, the statute criminalizes conduct that, quote, otherwise corruptly obstructs an official proceeding, and the word corruptly is so vague without any objective limitations on it that it invites prosecutorial abuse. You see, the obstruction statute is in essence meant to criminalize destroying evidence or tampering with witnesses, that kind of thing. But it also has this broad add-on provision that, after stating that destroying evidence and things like that are criminal conduct, also criminalizes conduct that otherwise corruptly obstructs. Before January 6th and the events on that date, the statute hadn't been used outside the context of evidence impairment. So there is a very strong argument, as stated by Justice Katsas, that the statute should not apply in a case where the alleged obstruction concerns an attempt to prevent a congressional proceeding from occurring. So if the Supreme Court rules in favor of Fisher, that's going to deal a strong blow against Jack Smith's case against Trump in D.C. And the fact that a ruling on this question will be coming down from the United States Supreme Court likely in late June is good cause to delay the trial of President Trump. In fact, in light of the pending Supreme Court determination on this critical question of the novel use of the statute that is at the heart of Jack Smith's prosecution of President Trump, there is likely little chance that the trial will take place before the election. That would be a very good thing, not only for President Trump, but for the country as a whole and for the rule of law itself. Well, if you like the content that we are providing, please go ahead and if you're watching this on YouTube or on Rumble, subscribe to our channel, like the video, drop a comment into the comment section. Doing each of those things helps us tremendously. Also, you can go visit our sponsor, MyPillow, at mypillow.com and use promo code WARDLOW, W-A-R-D-L-O-W, to get discounts on many of their fine products. That's promo code WARDLOW, W-A-R-D-L-O-W, on mypillow.com. Now, behind the headlines. First up today, Rob Reiner recently tweeted out a trailer to a new movie called God and Country that received a lot of attention this last week. The trailer featured people like fake conservative David French and even the creator of VeggieTales. The content of the movie was pretty clear. It's a movie attacking Christianity. Now, the movie's proponents will likely say, no, it's attacking Christian nationalism, not Christianity. And they probably would also add that the people speaking out against Christian nationalism in the movie are Christians. Look, I'm not sure there's any one concrete definition of Christian nationalism in existence right now. But as a party, I hope Republicans, by and large, use their Christianity to inform their worldview. Of course, you have to do that. You have to base your worldview on your faith. Morality cannot but be informed by and shaped by one's faith. That's just the way it is. In fact, the root of morality is God and God's law. Without that, there really isn't such a thing as objective morality. So you cannot discuss morality without, or hold to morals without having some kind of faith in a higher power. It just doesn't make sense. There's no basis for it. If everything is random and we're just here by accident, well, then morality isn't really a thing, is it? But there is a God, and Christ does exist, and so we have that basis for morality. So our faith has to inform our morality, and it has to shape our morality. And all of the laws that we have are based on some kind of moral conception. So you can't divorce morality from politics either. This always bothers me. Every single law is pointed at some kind of moral aim, even a speed limit law. Well, what's the object of a speed limit? It's to save lives. Why do you want to save lives? Because human lives are valuable. Why do we believe human lives are valuable? Because of the moral position coming out of the Judeo-Christian position that every single person is made in the image of God. So morality informs law, and it informs our worldview, and it has to be that way. Now, many Republicans have also branded themselves as nationalists, often citing the need for a more America First-centered agenda. Again, this is a very good thing, also a very good thing. So it's a very good thing to have America First perspective and to be a nationalist for America, the beacon of light and hope for the world. And it's also a very good thing to have one's Christian faith informing one's morality. Those two things are good, and we put those together. That's nationalism and that's Christianity. Now, I don't know what the definition of Christian nationalism, but those two things separately are good things, and you put them together in one person, and that's a good thing as well. So here's where I stand. My Christian faith is the most important thing in my life. Everything else, including my politics, flows from the fact that I am a Christian. Rob Reiner, not a Christian. He's an atheist. Any Christian working with him on this project should reflect on their decision to participate in this terrible film. Perhaps they truly believe they are fighting something outside of Christianity itself. Many churches across our great nation have lost the true message of the gospel, after all. Churches that support abortion, affirming churches that distort the institution of marriage, churches that claim Jesus was a refugee or that the apostles were non-binary, churches that claim God is a woman. Politics, and left-wing politics in particular, has certainly corrupted many churches. Like I just said, it's our religion that should inform our politics, not our politics that should inform our religion. We are to follow Christ first. That's where our true north must be. As a Christian, it seems pretty obvious that this film is an attack on Christianity itself and not on some political ideology. It's an attack squarely on the Christian faith. But the boogeyman that Reiner is supposedly attacking should exist, and it should exist in this way. This is the proper way to think about it. Christians across the country need to show up at the polls to defend life, to defend children, to defend parental rights, to defend marriage, basically to defend what is good and to oppose evil. We need to be in the political mix to do that. Jesus said, "Give unto Caesar that which is Caesar's," right? Caesar, and that makes a lot of sense. So we don't want politics to corrupt the church. But morality in our faith, faith which informs our morality, and morality and faith which inform our political views, we need to take that into the political arena and combat evil with it. This is not a situation like in the Roman Empire where there was dictatorial rule by the emperor, and there's nothing you could do about it, right? Instead, we have a representative republic where we can go and select our leaders. And so then that comes along with it a moral duty to go ahead and get engaged and to use the rights that we have and so to go ahead and vote for people that are going to oppose evil. So we absolutely must use our faith and morality to inform our politics and get into the fight. So Christians must show up at the polls and oppose those who are just fine with the slaughter of innocent children, for example, innocent children in the womb, and people that support the castration of kids. Those are absolute evils that must be fought in the political arena by Christians. Now is the time for Christians to stand up for human life and for human liberty, and for the Christian concept that every life is valuable because every human being is made in the image of God. We need to stand up for that truth now more than ever. Now is not the time for churches to pretend that they should avoid the fight against evil because doing so entails being engaged in political issues, like I just described. On the contrary, we need pastors to preach against and stand against the evils of these current times. We also need a church body so strong that we lift each other up during these trying times. It's our job to be bold enough to stand up for what is right. All right, up next, Alex Jones is back on Twitter. Alex Jones is one of those names that you most certainly know by now. He has a particular brand of conservatism and the media that can't easily be ignored. He's got quite a loud voice. Now, some of you are for sure fans of Jones, and some of you might get annoyed by him. He tends to be a bit out there, that is for sure. But here's one thing that we should all be able to agree on. It's a good thing his voice is now back on Twitter, or I guess it's now called X. Many questions were left unanswered when Elon Musk took over Twitter. Conservatives were cautiously optimistic about the change in ownership, hopefully leading to more free speech and less censorship of the political right. We did not know at the time what was up Elon's sleeve, but it turns out that Elon, by and large, was prepared to do very great things. This doesn't mean things are perfect and that censorship no longer exists, certainly, and certainly exists on lots of other platforms, but we certainly can look at this platform, X, as being much, much improved compared to the pre-Elon era. One can certainly question the vote on this X user, by popular demand method of unbanning people, for example. But true to his word, Elon Musk unbanned Jones and Trump and many other conservatives. So what does this mean for 2024? Well, we still have to fight to get information out, but colluding with big tech companies to censor conservative viewpoints, that's less of an option now for the government or for the left than it was before. We have the platform of Twitter, which will be much more open and have a much broader reach. Does this mean the battle is over? Of course not. There are still many other platforms. There's a lot more work to do to fight censorship. It means that we will have to stay vigilant and stay one step ahead of our opponents during these difficult times. Trump versus Biden is happening, and you're either on Team America first, or Team Recession and Global Chaos. That would be Team Biden. Our party needs to get its leaders in order and ducks in a row now before election season starts, because this will be the most important election of our lifetimes. All right, third and finally today on Behind the Headlines, Tucker Carlson has founded the Tucker Carlson Network. This is basically an all-out assault on corporate media, and it's about time. It used to be, Fox News for the conservatives, MSNBC for the liberals, CNN for basically airports, right? Well, not anymore. The leftists have taken over corporate media almost entirely. Jesse Waters is still a great entertainer, and you got some good people over on Fox, but conservatives and libertarians and independents, they're looking elsewhere for their news. Why are people leaving the corporate media? Well, for starters, we live in an era where podcasting is very easy to do. If you have the time and willing to put in the effort, you can build your own podcast. There's a lot of different news sources out there, a lot of independent sources for news. Broader picture, the corporate media built an empire by playing both sides, essentially. The problem is, if you were a little bit too aggressive to one side or to the other side, all the bosses in corporate media, they didn't like that too much. So what happened to Bill O'Reilly and Glenn Beck and eventually Tucker Carlson is this: they got too powerful, too influential, and they were speaking true things, and the bosses didn't like them speaking true things. Now, I'm not going to give you a specific example of this next thing, but another problem with corporate media structure is that they put many newscasters and opinion folks on that just don't really have much original to say. They just repeat the same boring talking points over and over and over, and they're not going to make any waves, and then they just get their paycheck, and that's all they really do. It's not very interesting. The problem with all this is that we are living in difficult times, and people need to hear the truth. It's why Tucker Carlson became an overnight sensation. He was speaking to America directly, often going against GOP talking points to drive the message home that both parties have basically abandoned the American people. So good for Tucker on his new network. Good for patriots like Glenn Beck, Bill O'Reilly, the folks over the Daily Wire, Mike Lindell, Steve Bannon. We need patriots like these folks leading the charge against the left. We need patriots speaking the truth. Well, before I dive into the deep dive for the day, I just want to wish everyone a very Merry Christmas. This will be the last show prior to Christmas and prior to the New Year. So Merry Christmas and Happy New Year as well. Look forward to seeing you all again in the New Year. Have a very safe and happy Christmas and New Year. Now for our deep dive. President Biden and Secretary of State Anthony Blinken succeeded in forcing Israel into a 7-day ceasefire. This is just a little while ago, I'm sure you remember. And now, predictably, that ceasefire has failed and fighting has resumed. But the Israeli-Hamas conflict is just a part of a much larger, longer-term war. Led and orchestrated by the Iranians, there is an axis of hatred and evil aligned against Israel that will not rest until the whole of the Jewish state is pushed into the sea. And that is just the first of their sinister goals. We, as the leader of the West, the United States, are also in the axis's crosshairs. This war against Israel is just the beginning. There are evil forces at work here, ceaselessly plotting our demise, and with far more support than most would like to believe. Just look at the shocking level of worldwide support for Hamas and their terror. Those who support Hamas would most likely cheer America's destruction as well. Standing by Israel and fighting against Hamas isn't just about Israel's survival. The actions of the United States, or lack thereof, have direct ramifications for the larger conflict between militant Islam and the Judeo-Christian West that has been raging for some time now. We must stand with Israel. We must oppose Hamas and their Iranian overlords. This enemy is far too dedicated, brutal, and supported to ignore. And guess what? Calling for ceasefires and war stoppages, calling as President Biden did just yesterday for Israel to tone down its methods of war, that's not standing with Israel. The United States nations and the worldwide left are calling for a long-term ceasefire between Hamas and Israel. Even the Pope has weighed in, saying on December 3rd, quote, in Gaza, there is a lot of suffering. There's a lack of basic necessities. I hope that all those involved can reach a new agreement for a ceasefire as soon as possible. That's what he said. Pope Francis went on to call for solutions other than weapons. What solutions would those be? Whatever they are, they cannot just cover the problem and kick the can down the road. Real solutions get to the core of the issue, dealing with more than just the symptoms. In this case, the core of the issue is simple. Hamas and those who support them do not believe Israel has a right to exist. They are anti-Semites. Back on Friday, April 14th, tens of thousands of Iranians, urged on by their government, marched in the streets chanting death to Israel and death to America. According to the Times of Israel, there were multiple banners flown in the huge crowd saying things like, the destruction of Israel is near, and Palestine is the axis of unity of the Muslim world, whatever that means. I guess that is what you would expect on Iran's annual Jerusalem Day, which is an annual holiday in Iran to show support for the Palestinian cause against Israel. It's craziness. Even Iranian President Ibrahim Raisi appeared with the crowds. This is a big deal in Iran, and it shows their true hatred of Israel and of America. But this isn't a surprise. How many times over the years have we seen video clips of Iranians chanting death to America or for an end to Israel? Well, here's one of those clips from sometime in 2020. Let's watch. Terrible. So the Iranians clearly hate Israel, they clearly hate the United States, and they put their money where their mouth is. On November 14th, the Department of the Treasury put out a press release on Hamas leaders and financiers. They said, quote, Iranian support primarily through its Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps has enabled Hamas's and PIJ's terrorist activities to include the transfer of hundreds of millions of dollars in financial assistance and the furnishing of both weapons and operational training. Congressman Bill Huizenga put a specific number on the money that Hamas gets from Iran. He said, quote, Hamas committed a brutal terrorist attack on the state of Israel, where 30 Americans tragically lost their lives. It is important to note Hamas receives approximately $350 million per year in support from Iran, or roughly 93% of their total funding. 93%. That is effectively all of their funding. And they are never going to stop, never. Sure, Iran might tone it down from time to time in response to various things, to protect its assets and personnel, or to buy time for the next wave of attacks. But the engine that drives this brutal machine, which is pure hatred, will never stop running. The Iranians have said as much. To stop Hamas, we must stop the Iranian regime. It's as simple as that. But Hamas has more supporters than just Iran. The Palestinian people themselves are standing by Hamas. But wait, how could they? The Palestinian people are complete innocents who are being brutalized and murdered by the oppressive Israeli regime, right? Or at least that's what the United Nations and the Democrats and the media want you to believe. Of course, the truth is far, far different from that, and it's much more complex. In May of this year, solid student majorities at both major Palestinian universities in the West Bank supported the Hamas groups running in student government elections there. The Palestinian youth are moving towards Hamas and away from Fatah, the traditional rival party of Hamas and the party of the Palestinian Authority. They are moving towards more violence and more killing of Jews. But now we have even more to consider. As reported by the Foundation for Defense of Democracy's, support for Hamas surges in the West Bank. They wrote, quote, a poll conducted after October 7 found that 62% of Palestinians in the West Bank have a very positive view of Hamas, and 68% extremely support the attacks of October 7th. Another 26% view Hamas somewhat positively, and 15% somewhat support the October 7 massacre. Let that sink in for a moment. 68% of West Bank Palestinians extremely support the Hamas attack on Israel, and 15% somewhat support the attack. Forget they view Hamas positively, that is bad enough, but supporting the actual terror attack? That's something else and something crazy. Supporting the beheading of babies, the burning of people alive, mass rape and torture, the murder of civilians and children, it's pure evil of the worst kind. And 83% of Palestinians in the West Bank at least somewhat support it. So what is Israel to do? What are we to do? No one can trust the Palestinian civilians. 83% of them support the terror attack. How many of them are helping Hamas? How many of them would help Hamas if given the chance? Recently, Israel captured documents of the dead bodies of Hamas fighters that give some insight into what happened on October 7th. This is from NBC News. Quote, one page labeled Top Secret outlines a plan of attack for Kfar Saad, saying Combat Unit 1 is directed to contain the new Da'at school, while Combat Unit 2 is to collect hostages, search the B'nai Akiva Youth Center, and search the old Da'at school. Another page, labeled Top Secret Maneuver, describes a plan for a Hamas unit to secure the east side of Kfar Saad, while a second unit controls the west. It says, kill as many as possible and capture hostages. That is the plan that so-called innocent Palestinian civilians supported after it happened. There is hatred here, real hatred, and it is the same hatred that drives the Iranians and their plans to destroy Israel. And that hatred has spread much further than many know. We have heard much lately about humanitarian aid and humanitarian disaster ongoing with the Gaza Strip. There must be a ceasefire or a pause to allow humanitarian aid into the Palestinian people, says the leftist media over and over and over. But where does the aid actually go? Who delivers and distributes it? Enter the United Nations Relief Works Agency for Palestinian Refugees in the Near East. We'll just call it UNRWA, UNRWA, UNRWA. It was established by the United Nations General Assembly and began operating in May of 1950. Oh, and it is one of the largest United Nations programs in existence. Here's what they do from the What We Do section of their website. UNRWA, this is a quote, UNRWA human development and humanitarian services encompass primary and vocational education, primary health care, relief and social services, infrastructure and camp improvement, microfinance and emergency response, including in situations of armed conflict. It is a big program. Their mandate covers about 6 million Palestinian refugees, as so-called refugees. In 2022, their budget was $1.6 billion. Yes, you heard that right, $1.6 billion. But probably their most influential activity is teaching. Their schools, so-called educate, 543,000 Palestinian children in Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, the Gaza Strip, and the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. I bet you can see where this is going. In March of 2023, an investigative report by 2 reputable groups was released, and it was disturbing to say the least. What they found was very disturbing. Here's the intro from the report. It says that, quote, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian Refugees, that's UNRWA, claims that its schools teach Palestinian children about peace, tolerance, and human rights. Well, the joint report by United Nations Watch, UN Watch, and the Institute for Monitoring Peace, Cultural Tolerance, and School Education shows that the opposite is true. They go into detail about UNRWA teachers who incite terror and anti-Semitism on social media. The report dives into the content taught in UNRWA schools. And yes, the content that they teach, it glorifies terrorism, incites to violence, demonizes Israel, denies Israel's existence, and promotes anti-Semitism. It does that directly. In November, UN Watch released a follow-up report on the UNRWA with 10 new examples of its teachers celebrating the Hamas massacre of Israelis on October 7th. Here is one example. From the report, quote, at 9:09 a.m. on October 7th, as news began to spread about the Hamas atrocities in Israel, Osama Ahmed posted a gleeful celebration of the massacre, saying, quote, Allah is great, reality surpasses our wildest dreams. He also liked comments on his post praising the attack. Lovely. All those Palestinian children are being schooled in hatred. And then we have Hamas stealing 24,000 liters of fuel from the UNRWA on October 16th. At first, the UN acknowledged the theft, but then deleted the post. Later, the IDF released an intercepted phone call between Hamas and a Gaza citizen with the director of the hospital in question on the line. They were discussing Hamas taking fuel from the hospital. Hamas justified it by saying they were, quote, working as a government for the sake of our country. I wonder how many other times Hamas found themselves in possession of humanitarian aid from UNRWA. So UNRWA is full of Hamas sympathizers indoctrinates Palestinian youths into hatred of Israel and anti-Semitism, and in the end, helps to supply Hamas. I guess we can't be too surprised, though. Look at its parent organization, the United Nations. On October 27th, the United Nations General Assembly passed a resolution. Guess what? It did not condemn the terror attack or even name Hamas. Rather, the resolution condemned, quote, all violence since October 7th without mentioning that Israel was the victim, and it called for protecting Palestinian civilians. Of course, it said nothing about Israeli civilians, and it also called for an immediate ceasefire. You see, the United Nations is full of the same hatred against Israel that most Palestinians have. And just one more thing about this. We, the U.S. taxpayers, well, we're paying for a huge portion of this. Since taking office, the Biden administration has given UNRWA $730 million. But none of the anti-Semitism in the United Nations seems to matter to the leftists and the legacy media, who breathlessly focus on casualty figures. They repeat Palestinian propaganda, claiming that Israel has killed about 15,000 Palestinians, citing numbers from the Gaza Ministry of Health. But that ministry admittedly does not distinguish between Hamas militants and civilians, and it is run by the Hamas government, so we can't really trust that figure at all. We have no way of actually knowing how many civilians have actually died. Of course, the loss of human life is certainly a tragedy, but here's the thing. It is a tragedy of Hamas's making. Israel, for its part, is going out of its way to avoid civilian casualties. Our own White House, which has been loudly demanding that Israel protect Gazan civilians, even said on December 3rd that Israel is making considerable efforts to minimize civilian casualties. Of course, just yesterday, they just turned up their rhetoric and are telling Israel to change its methods. So they're putting more pressure on Israel to basically stop going after Hamas or to limit its tactics. Well, National Security spokesman John Kirby earlier said that, quote, we believe they have been receptive to our messages here of trying to minimize civilian casualties. So they admitted that earlier. He then mentioned how the IDF published online maps of places Gazans could go to for safety. Of that, he said, quote, there's not a whole lot of modern militaries that would do that, to telegraph their punches in that way, so they are making an effort. And that's true. Israel is hampering its own military efforts to help spare Gazan civilians. That's how much Israel values human life. Well, the same obviously can't be said of Hamas. Israel has dropped leaflets, created humanitarian corridors, allowed for humanitarian pauses, issued evacuation orders and directions for Gazan civilians before military operations begin. They also use precision-guided munitions to hit specific Hamas targets rather than bomb entire areas. But Hamas, for its part, uses the Palestinian people as human shields. They placed weapons and command centers in and under hospitals and schools. They told their own people to stay in place when Israel issued evacuation orders, and they threatened them at gunpoint when they tried to leave. See, Hamas wants civilian casualties. Just behind killing Israelis, causing Palestinian civilian casualties is their second priority. And it is more evidence that the hatred that drives this enemy corrupts and blinds them. You see, the civilian casualties are what Hamas and Iran need to give their sympathizers worldwide an excuse to support something that no right-minded human could ever support. It is very hard to justify backing groups that behead babies and all of that, but there are plenty in the United Nations and elsewhere that cite civilian casualty numbers to justify their support of Hamas and its aims. Which brings us to the recent 7-day ceasefire that Israel allowed. After massive pressure from leftists around the world, Israel agreed to a short ceasefire in exchange for hostage negotiations. The truce did secure the release of a very good thing, the release of 110 hostages, including 4 U.S. citizens, in exchange for 240 Palestinian prisoners. So something very good did come out of it, the release of those hostages. But there are many who wanted this ceasefire to be permanent. Any ceasefire, though, allows Hamas to reorganize, more effectively hide its assets among civilians in Gaza, and then plan its next moves. A ceasefire helps Hamas while hindering Israeli efforts to destroy Hamas. The Biden administration has not publicly called for a permanent ceasefire, but behind the scenes they have applied heavy pressure on Israel, and that pressure is becoming more public every day, especially just yesterday. Biden and Blinken have focused on publicly calling for Israel to find ways to protect civilians and get humanitarian aid into Gaza. But their support of Israel, which has been more support than most Democrats would like to see, is showing signs of cracking. In a meeting with Israel's war cabinet the week before last, Blinken made it clear that Israel does not have unlimited support from the United States or the international community. He said, quote, I underscore the imperative for the U.S. that the massive loss of civilian life and displacement of the scale that we saw in northern Gaza not be repeated in the south. He wants Israel to change the way they are fighting and supported extending the truce, but stop short of calling for a permanent ceasefire. According to the Times of Israel, Israel's defense minister said in the meeting that the Israeli public is united behind the destruction of Hamas, even if it takes months. Blinken did not like that. Apparently, he disagreed, saying that he wasn't sure how long Israel could have international backing while fighting at the same intensity. Reports say that Blinken measured the time left for Israel to eliminate Hamas in weeks, not even months. But Blinken did acknowledge the challenges Israel is facing, saying, quote, Hamas intentionally embeds within civilians, within and below hospitals, schools, apartment buildings, refugee camps. So, how is Israel supposed to eliminate Hamas and avoid all civilian casualties when Hamas uses Palestinians as human shields? Well, they can't. Hamas is buying time with the blood of the Palestinian civilians while their sympathizers worldwide use that blood as an excuse to pressure Israel to allow Hamas to ultimately survive the current war. This twisted circular reasoning is more evidence that Hamas and all those who are supporting them or sympathetic to them care nothing for Palestinian civilians. They are using them as pawns. All those people holding signs and marching for the Palestinian cause, well, they are liars or idiots or both. Israel has shown more to care to the Palestinian civilians than Hamas or any of their supporters ever have. All the neighboring Arab nations have refused to allow the Palestinians into their territory. To them, Iran and Hamas especially, the plight of the Palestinian people is nothing more than a tool to be used against Israel in the West. They invented this plight. It is sick and twisted, but that is what pure hatred does to people. It makes them sick and twisted. So Biden wants Israel to wrap up the fighting and protect the Gazan civilians in the process. He wants more truces and more humanitarian aid, but not a permanent ceasefire, at least not yet. But the 7-day truce fell apart because of Hamas. Indeed, the United States government admitted as much. Blinken told reporters in Dubai, quote, "It's important to understand why the pause came to an end. It came to an end because of Hamas." Yes, 2 Hamas gunmen killed 3 people at a Jerusalem bus stop during rush hour on Thursday morning, the 30th of November. They also fired rockets into Israel during the truce. Blinken also mentioned Hamas's failure to fulfill commitments to release certain hostages. Hamas just can't help themselves. Their hatred is far too great. The evil in their souls is deeply entrenched. And then there's this. Hamas's leader in Gaza, Yahya Sinwar, finally made a public statement the week before last, his first since launching what Hamas named the Al-Aqsa Floods campaign. His ominous comment was this: "The leaders of the occupation should know," he said, "October 7th was just a rehearsal," close quote. Chilling. But we already knew that, didn't we? They are never going to stop. Never. And if they were able to push Israel into the sea, even then, do you really think that Hamas and their supporters are going to just hang up their AK-47s and ride off into the sunset? Of course not. Their hatred is too great. It's not just for Israel. Hamas is propped up by Iran, and the Iranians have set their various proxy groups on a mission to attack the United States in the Middle East. Since mid-October, U.S. forces in Iraq and Syria were attacked 74 times by Iranian proxy groups. 74 times. And now, Iran's minions in Yemen are attacking ships in the Strait of Hormuz, including U.S. ships. The destroyer USS Carney shot down several missiles after Iran-backed Houthi rebels fired on commercial ships transiting the straits. U.S. Central Command said the attacks represent a direct threat to international commerce and maritime security. Our government then said that we have every reason to believe that the attacks were fully enabled by Iran and that the United States will consider all appropriate responses in full coordination with its international partners. Add to this FBI Director Christopher Wray's testimony the week before last to the Senate that the terror threat to America has reached unprecedented levels. He said, quote, "I've never seen a time where all the threats or so many of the threats are elevated all exactly at the same time." And Lindsey Graham pushed him and went a little bit deeper. Let's just watch this.
Blinking red lights analogy about 9/11. All the lights were blinking red before 9/11. Apparently, obviously, all of us missed it. Would you say that there's multiple blinking red lights out there?
I see blinking lights everywhere I turn.
Okay, all right. Can't say any better than that.
I see blinking lights everywhere. That's very disturbing. The entire situation is far worse than Biden and Blinken would have you believe. In case our president hasn't noticed, this is a war, a real war. The only reason we don't have Iranian and Hamas terrorists running around the United States blowing everything in sight is because we are orders of magnitude stronger than the Iranians, their terror proxies, and their terrorist allies combined. But that's the only reason. Iran, Hamas, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, Islamic extremism, they are all consumed by hatred of Israel, hatred of the United States, hatred of the West, hatred of the so-called infidel, hatred of freedom itself. They cannot abide any group of people that is free to challenge the Islamist extremist worldview. They have made it their mission, their jihad, to stamp out freedom and the infidel. There isn't a happy ending here. In the long run, this appears to be an us or them scenario. With Iran as their leader, this brutal axis centered on terror and Islamic extremism does not acknowledge Israel's right to exist. And just as Iran is the power behind Hamas and friendly with ISIS and the like, the United States is tied to Israel. We in Israel are both free peoples who reject Islamic extremism. We are beacons of light to the world. This Iranian axis of terror cannot allow us to exist. So we are already at war, and the clock is ticking. Look around the world. Look around the United States. There is support for the terror axis everywhere you see. The United Nations, the EU, colleges right here in the United States. There seem to be large numbers of people who accept what Hamas did as if it was part of some kind of struggle. These people have been indoctrinated. It's very sad. All those people waving Palestinian flags and chanting death to Israel, all those groups posting favorable messages about Hamas on social media, all those officials at the United Nations and the EU who make excuses for Iranian terror and look the other way when they see clear anti-Semitism. Well, those folks, they are also enemies of freedom and on the wrong side of this conflict. There is a reason that the Iranian axis of terror is friendly with the CCP and with Putin's Russia. And there is a reason that the Taliban sent a large delegation to Tehran with the intention of strengthening ties. The darkness is growing, and it is time for the United States, as leader of the free world, to finally act. Hamas, Iran, the Taliban, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, all the Iranian proxy groups, they're all part of a larger strategic threat to both Israel and the United States, and we must meet this threat head on. President Biden, terrible President Biden, he must stop focusing on truces and humanitarian issues. He must stop pressuring Israel to change its tactics and to soften them. Israel is doing the best it can with the impossible situation they are in. Our focus must be on helping Israel destroy Hamas, degrading Iran, and beating down terror wherever it may be found. Anything else sends the wrong message to our enemies, who have shown us just how far they are willing to go to destroy us. They must know that we are every bit as determined to live as they are determined to kill us. We played along with the leftists at the United Nations. We pushed for a truce, pushed for humanitarian aid, pressure Israel to do things that made it harder for them to secure their own nation. Well, now the gloves must come completely off. Anyone who had anything to do with the October 7th attack must be brought to justice, just as we did after the 9/11 attacks. It doesn't matter where they are or who is harboring them. Israel has said it will hunt Hamas down worldwide, and we must actively help them. The same must be done with respect to the Iranians, just like Trump did with the Iranian terror general Qasem Soleimani, killed by a U.S. missile strike aided by Israeli intelligence. Biden and Blinken must change course. Rather than worrying about the opinion of worldwide leftists and terrorist supporters in their base, they must put their focus on fighting this war, the one we are already in. They must focus on helping Israel destroy Hamas and the Iranian leadership. After the Iranian attacks on shipping in the Persian Gulf, our government said publicly that the United States will consider all appropriate responses to Iran. Well, we must make good on that threat. What more will it take? We need to cut the mullahs in Iran off the knees now before they get any stronger and before they get nuclear weapons. As FBI Director Wray said, there are red blinking lights everywhere. Well, let's not ignore them this time. We know where the threat is. We know who is considering attacking us, and we know just how brutal it could be. Let's take effective preemptive action and break the Iranians and their proxies before they have a chance to hit us the way they attacked Israel. We need to strike every major Iran terror proxy we can find right now. We need to strike Iranian nuclear sites, destroy their missile sites, airfields, and headquarters. There won't be a regional war if Iranians can't fight one. And we have the capability to damage Iran enough to make that the case, but only if we use the power that we have. So far, Biden has refused to do that. He's refused to do anything meaningful. He has refused to fight the war that we are already a part of, the war that we find ourselves in largely because of Biden's own weakness on the world stage. All of that needs to change, and it needs to change now. Well, that's all for today's episode. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you like the content we're providing, if you're watching this on YouTube or on Rumble, please go ahead and subscribe to the channel, like the videos, and one more thing, the CCP must be destroyed. Oh, and one more thing, Merry Christmas.